The Young and the Restless spoilers? What makes this storyline so dangerous is not the obvious threat of violence, but the quiet precision of a revenge plan built around weakness, timing, and emotional neglect. Matt Clark does not need to storm into Genoa City and tear Nick Newman's life apart in public. He understands something far more lethal. The most effective way to destroy Nick is to make Nick participate in his own downfall. That is why this entire situation feels darker than an ordinary vendetta. It is not just an attack, it is a psychological siege, and every delayed reaction from the Newman family gives it more power. Matt knows exactly where Nick is vulnerable. After decades of slipping away from justice and surviving consequences that should have ruined him long ago, he has become the kind of enemy who no longer acts out of impulse. He acts with patience, memory, and calculation. Nick's broken femur and his dependence on medication are not random details in this conflict. They are the opening Matt has been waiting for. Physical pain has a way of lowering a person's defenses, and for someone like Nick, who has always relied on toughness, control, and instinct, being trapped inside a damaged body is already humiliating. The injury does more than weaken him physically. It shakes his sense of identity. It reminds him that strength can vanish in an instant, and once that fear gets inside a man like Nick, every bad coping mechanism becomes easier to justify. That is where the tragedy starts to deepen. The medication is not merely a medical tool anymore. It becomes an emotional escape hatch, a temporary silence, a way to dull more than pain. It numbs frustration, helplessness, and the growing fear that he is losing control over his own life. Matt understands that he does not need to force Nick into addiction or recklessness. He only needs to create pressure, isolation, and enough emotional confusion for Nick to make one compromised choice after another. That is what makes this kind of manipulation so chilling. It always looks on the surface as if the victim is simply failing on his own. I'm ready for a new storyline. I'm over all the Newman drama, Lucy Newman, the Matt Clark stuff, and Nick's drug problem, not to mention the whole Mariah storyline. This has drug on long enough. We need something new going on. And it needs to be something good. Yes, the former billionaire needs to, at long, long last, forget about that renegade he had the misfortune of being married to, and focus on the future. His lawyer here would be an ideal choice. A much, much, much better choice. He should do what Billy suggested the first time he ever had a good idea. Go back to France, start from scratch. He can rebuild and start a brand new family with Amanda. And those judgmental brat kids of his are no better than their mother. Forget it, Zem Them. I've never seen Victor so off his rocker before. I don't know what's next for him, but I am having trouble justifying all his actions lately. Anybody else having issues being on his side these days, to lay blame on Tessa is totally unfair. Should we all be nasty to strangers in case they turn out to be evil men from someone's past? Having said that, she is trying to do the right thing. I commend her for that, but I love her with Daniel. I wish it would have worked out for them. And to be fair, one of the most frustrating parts of this story is the question viewers cannot stop asking: how has everyone around Nick allowed him to drift this far? It is a valid question, and yet the answer is painful because it feels believable. Families do not always fail each other through cruelty. Sometimes they fail through distraction, exhaustion, and the false belief that someone strong will eventually steady himself. Nick has built his identity on resilience for so long that the people around him may not fully grasp how close he is to breaking. They see a man struggling, but not necessarily a man being methodically cornered. Adam Newman becomes one of the clearest examples of this tragic delay. Once he learns how bad Nick's situation is becoming, he is pulled into a familiar internal conflict. Adam knows Nick well enough to understand that direct interference could backfire. Nick is proud, defensive, and often suspicious of anything that feels like control, especially from Adam. That history matters. Their bond has always been complicated by rivalry, resentment, and the constant burden of old wounds. So Adam hesitates, and his hesitation is understandable. In another kind of story, caution might even be wise, but here caution becomes dangerous. In a crisis shaped by manipulation, waiting too long is exactly how the manipulator wins. There is also a bitter irony in Adam's position. He is often the one accused of bringing chaos into the Newman orbit, yet in this situation he may be one of the few people capable of recognizing how an enemy weaponizes emotional instability. Still, recognition is not the same as action. Adam is pulled in other directions, burdened by his own problems, his own instincts, his own tendency to calculate instead of simply respond. That makes him tragically human. He is not indifferent to Nick. He is trapped between concern and resentment, between old loyalty and old damage, and that emotional hesitation may cost more than he realizes. At the same time, Sharon Newman is consumed by an entirely different crisis, one that carries its own heartbreaking logic. Mariah Copeland's downward spiral has become too serious, too painful, and too emotionally loaded for Sharon to treat as anything less than an emergency. When Mariah agrees to the plea deal, Christine Romolati has urged her to accept it may look like progress on paper, but emotionally it feels like a shattered woman surrendering to the weight of her own unraveling. Sharon sees that. She knows Mariah is not just facing legal consequences. She is facing the accumulated force of buried trauma, distorted guilt, and a mind that no longer trusts itself. Mariah's road to this point is one of the most psychologically haunting parts of the whole situation. What began during that ill-fated business trip for Cassidy first was never just about one bad choice. It was about memory projection and unresolved trauma quietly resurfacing in the ugliest possible form. The older man she was drawn to did not represent attraction in any ordinary sense. He stirred something darker and more destabilizing because he reminded her of Ian Ward, the figure who left such profound emotional scars on her life. That connection matters because it reveals how easily trauma can disguise itself. Mariah was not just reacting to a man. She was reacting to an entire buried history she had never fully escaped. The flashbacks revealing that Mariah strangled the man without actually killing him add another layer of moral and emotional complexity. On the surface, it changes the legal reality. But emotionally, the damage was already done. Mariah believed she had crossed an unforgivable line. And once a person starts to... Her alienation from Tessa, her erratic behavior, and eventually the kidnapping of Dominic all grow from that poisoned inner belief that she is already beyond repair. That does not excuse what she did, and I think the story works best when it does not try to erase responsibility, but it also asks for a harder, more uncomfortable kind of fairness. It asks whether accountability means anything if nobody is willing to look honestly at the psychological wreckage underneath it. Sharon is left carrying that impossible burden. She is trying to save Mariah from prison, from public ruin, and from herself all at once. In that condition, it makes painful sense that she misses what is happening to Nick. Normally, Sharon might notice the emotional signs faster than anyone else. She knows Nick's rhythms, his silences, his way of pretending he is more in control than he really is. But this time, she is stretched too thin. This is not because she does not care. It is because love has limits when crisis arrives from too many directions at once. That is one of the fairest and saddest truths in this storyline. Sharon is not failing because she is blind. She is failing because she is human. That human limitation is exactly what Matt Clark exploits. He does not need to overpower the Newmans. He only needs them to be busy, divided, emotionally drained, and slightly out of sync with one another. He needs Adam to hesitate. He needs Sharon to be overwhelmed. He needs Nick to feel isolated even when surrounded by people who love him. He needs everyone to respond to the wrong emergency at the wrong time. And that is what makes his plan feel so viciously personal. He is not just attacking Nick's body or reputation. He is attacking the fragile timing of family itself. Nick's emotional state becomes the true battleground. The deeper he slips into pain management as a form of emotional escape, the more fragile his judgment becomes. He may begin by telling himself he simply needs relief, that he deserves some quiet from the relentless pressure that he can stop whenever he chooses. But denial is never loud in stories like this. It whispers, it sounds reasonable, it wears the face of exhaustion. And for a man like Nick, whose identity depends on being the stable one, admitting vulnerability may feel more threatening than the actual danger. That is often how self-destruction hides. It dresses itself up as endurance. What makes this conflict especially compelling is that Matt's scheme only works because it exposes weaknesses that already existed. That is why the story lands with such emotional force. The Newman family is powerful, but power has never guaranteed emotional health. There are old fractures here, old resentments, old habits of silence, old assumptions about who will survive and who will fall apart. Nick has long been treated as the one who can endure almost anything. Adam has long been viewed through the lens of suspicion and instability. Sharon has long been expected to absorb impossible emotional burdens. Mariah has long been carrying damage that never fully healed. Matt does not invent these conditions. He weaponizes them. That, in my view, is what makes the writing potentially strong when handled well. The villain is threatening, yes, but the deeper drama comes from the fact that every major character is forced to confront something truthful and uncomfortable about themselves. Nick has to face the possibility that his toughness has become a mask for denial. Adam has to face whether his insight is worthless if he never acts on it. Sharon has to face the unbearable truth that she cannot save everyone at once. Mariah has to face the devastation caused by trauma when it is left unspoken for too long. A good storyline does not simply ask who is guilty. It asks who has been emotionally absent, who has been lying to themselves, and who is finally going to pay the price for waiting too long. There is also a cruel thematic mirror between Nick and Mariah that gives the whole plot more depth. Both of them are trapped in altered versions of reality shaped by pain. Nick's pain is physical but increasingly emotional. Mariah's is psychological but spills into real-world consequences. Both are making destructive choices while the people who love them struggle to distinguish crisis from character. Both are in danger of becoming defined by the worst thing happening to them. And both stories challenge the people around them to decide whether love means intervention, trust, or something harsher and more necessary. If this all continues to escalate, the real explosion will not come from one revelation alone. It will come when the various crises collide. If Sharon finally looks up from Mariah's legal and emotional catastrophe, only to realize Nick has been unraveling right in front of her, the guilt could be enormous. If Adam reaches the point where he understands Matt's endgame too late, that failure could deepen his already complicated relationship with Nick in a devastating way. And if Nick discovers that his own family saw signs and still did not act fast enough, his sense of betrayal may become just as destructive as the drugs themselves. Sometimes the most painful betrayal is not active cruelty. It is realizing that the people who love you were present but not truly paying attention. Matt Clark is terrifying precisely because he turns that emotional negligence into strategy. He does not merely exploit pain. He studies the emotional traffic patterns around it. He understands who will rush to which fire, who will freeze, who will rationalize, who will avoid confrontation, and who will keep pretending things are manageable. That kind of villainy is not theatrical. It is intelligent, intimate, and deeply corrosive. It feeds on delay. It feeds on pride. It feeds on all the small moments when people choose not to ask one more question because they are afraid of what the answer might be. In the end, this story is not only about revenge. It is about emotional timing, buried trauma, and the devastating cost of assuming that strong people will always pull themselves back from the edge. Nick's struggle, Mariah's collapse, Sharon's divided heart, and Adam's hesitation all point to the same painful truth. Destruction rarely begins at the moment of impact. It begins much earlier in the silences, in the missed warning signs, in the private justifications, and in the dangerous hope that things are not as bad as they seem. Matt Clark understands that better than anyone, and that is exactly why he is so dangerous now. He is not just attacking the Newman family from the outside. He is turning their own emotional fractures into weapons, and unless someone sees the pattern soon, Nick may not be the only one who loses everything. There are moments in Genoa City when the surface appears calm, when the legacy families still carry themselves with the illusion of control, but beneath that polished exterior, something far more dangerous is unfolding, something patient, calculated, and deeply personal. This is not just another rivalry or corporate war. This is a psychological dismantling, and at the center of it stands Matt Clark, a man who has already survived what should have ended him, and who now returns not as a fugitive, but as a strategist with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. His game is not loud, not chaotic, but deliberate and more terrifying because of it. He is not trying to defeat the Newmans in public. He is trying to hollow them out from within, piece by piece, until what remains is unrecognizable even to themselves. What makes this storyline so compelling is the way every character becomes both a player and a pawn without fully realizing it. Matt does not need to attack directly because he has already identified the weak points and, more importantly, the emotional fractures that have existed long before his return. His relocation to Las Vegas is not an escape. It is an invitation, a calculated lure designed specifically for Nick Newman, a man whose loyalty to family and instinct to confront danger head-on can be weaponized against him. The reopening of Matt's world in Vegas is not about rebuilding a life. It is about setting a stage, one where the stakes are not just financial but psychological, and where the cost of one wrong decision could be irreversible. At the same time, Adam Newman is pulled into a parallel orbit, one that at first glance feels separate but is in truth deeply connected. His confession to Riza Thompson about his past, about the collapse of Newman Enterprises and how it forced him to rebuild himself, is not merely exposition. It is vulnerability disguised as strategy. Adam has always walked the line between reinvention and self-destruction, and what makes him fascinating here is that he believes he is in control again. The return of his so-called spider identity, the version of himself that thrives in high-risk environments, signals not just confidence, but a dangerous comfort with chaos. When a man like Adam starts to believe that risk is where he belongs, he becomes predictable in the worst possible way. Riza's role in this dynamic is one of the most intriguing and suspicious elements of the entire arc. Her challenge to Adam, pushing him into a game outside his comfort zone, is not just flirtation or curiosity. It is a test, a probe into how far he is willing to go, how easily he can be manipulated through ego and thrill. His success at blackjack earns him access to a higher stakes poker game, and that transition feels symbolic. It is not about cards. It is about escalation. Blackjack is controlled mathematical, almost disciplined. Poker, especially at the level Riza hints at, is psychological warfare. It is about reading people, bluffing and surviving long enough to outmaneuver everyone else. And in a story already driven by manipulation, that shift cannot be accidental. The possibility that Riza is connected to Matt Clark adds a layer of tension that reshapes everything. If she is indeed part of his network, then Adam is not being invited into a game. He is being guided into a trap, one that serves a much larger purpose. Removing Adam from Genoa City, even temporarily, creates a vacuum, and that vacuum leaves Nick exposed at precisely the moment he is most vulnerable. This is where the brilliance of Matt's strategy becomes undeniable. He is not just targeting individuals, he is separating them, isolating them, ensuring that when the attack comes, no one is in the right place to stop it. And Nick, already struggling with physical pain and the creeping reliance on medication, becomes the perfect target. His voluntary use of drugs, initially justified as a necessity, begins to blur into something more dangerous. What makes this particularly tragic is that Nick does not see himself as weak. He sees himself as enduring, as managing, as surviving. That mindset has always been his strength, but here it becomes his blind spot. Because when endurance turns into denial, it opens the door for manipulation. Matt does not need to push Nick into addiction. He only needs to ensure that no one intervenes early enough, that every warning sign is either missed or dismissed until it is too late. There is also an uncomfortable truth in how the Newman family responds to all of this, or rather how they fail to respond. It is easy to judge from the outside, to question why no one steps in, why no one forces a confrontation, why Nick is allowed to spiral. But the reality is more complicated and in many ways more realistic. Everyone is dealing with their own crisis, their own priorities, their own emotional exhaustion. Adam is entangled in his high-stakes games and his fragile sense of regained identity. Victor is focused on consolidating power after stripping Matt of his assets using stolen technology in a move that, while effective, also reveals his willingness to blur moral lines when necessary. Sharon is consumed by her own family turmoil, leaving her unable to fully recognize what is happening to Nick. No one is intentionally neglecting him, but collectively their distraction becomes negligence. Victor's role in all of this deserves particular attention because his actions, while seemingly victorious, may have unintentionally escalated the entire conflict. By using Phyllis Summers' stolen artificial intelligence tool to seize control of the Shadow Room and dismantle Matt's financial base, Victor believed he was eliminating a threat. And from a strategic standpoint, it was a bold and effective move. But what he may have underestimated is the psychological impact of that loss on someone like Matt. Stripping a man like that of his empire does not neutralize him. It radicalizes him. It transforms his objective from survival to vengeance, from rebuilding to destruction. In a way, Victor may have created the version of Matt that now threatens his family. This is where the story becomes morally complex, because it forces us to question whether the initial act of aggression, even if justified, ultimately set off a chain reaction that could have been avoided. It is not about assigning blame in a simple sense, but about recognizing that power, when used without restraint, often creates consequences that cannot be controlled. As the narrative progresses, everything begins to converge toward an inevitable collision. Adam, drawn deeper into the high-stakes world of Vegas, risks losing himself in the very identity he believes gives him strength. Nick, isolated and increasingly unstable, moves closer to a point where his decisions may no longer be reversible. Sharon, stretched to her emotional limits, may soon be forced to confront the reality that she cannot save everyone at once. And Matt, watching from the shadows, continues to tighten the net, ensuring that every move his enemies make only brings them closer to the outcome he desires. What makes the anticipated death of Matt Clark so fascinating is not the event itself, but the journey leading up to it. Because if this story is executed with the depth it promises, his downfall will not feel like a simple victory. It will feel like a cost one that has already reshaped the people involved in ways that cannot be undone. Nick may survive, but at what psychological price? Adam may return, but will he be stronger or more fractured than before? Victor may eliminate the threat, but will he recognize his role in creating it? And perhaps the most compelling question of all is whether anyone will truly learn from what has happened. Because in a world like this, where power, pride, and pain are constantly colliding, the line between victim and architect of one's own downfall is never as clear as it seems. Matt Clark may be playing a winner-takes-all game, but the truth is, even those who win may find that what they have gained is far less than what they have lost.